Hi everyone, I'm Dan Murphy. I'm CNBC's Middle East correspondent. I host our program Capital Connection weekdays in the Middle East based out of the UAE. So I'm really grateful that you're all sticking around for this next conversation. As most of you know, COP28 wrapped up in Dubai in the fourth quarter of last year with a really big call. And the call was to transition away from fossil fuels. Not a phase out, not a phase down, but a transition away. The agreement was broadly hailed by corporates and the business community as a success, as well as intergovernmental organizations that were on the ground. But of course, what we know is that 2023 was indeed the hottest year on record. So the onus of responsibility to really move the needle on climate now falls upon corporates and governments. So this conversation is really going to focus on what needs to happen in order to move that needle. So I am so thrilled to introduce my panel for this next conversation. Please make them feel welcome. Badr Jafar is the CEO of Crescent Group and Special Representative for Business and Philanthropy at COP28. Badr, welcome. Please make him feel welcome. Also joining me is Daniel Feldman, a partner at Covington, and he also served as the former Chief of Staff and Counselor to Secretary John Kerry, while of course Secretary Kerry served as Special Representative for Envoy for Climate. Daniel, welcome. Thank you for joining us. And Rachel Kyte is also here. She's founding co-chair of the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, or VCMI. Rachel, welcome to you as well. Thank you. Please take a seat. So thank you again all for joining me. And I know I did get the opportunity to speak with some of you at COP28 in Dubai. We had days and days of coverage on CNBC, and one of the key themes we were talking about on the ground there was not just the role of business and governments, but of course the role of COP28 itself. And so I wanted to talk specifically about the outcomes here. If you could give COP a score, how would you rank it? And how credible is this call to transition away from fossil fuels? Badr, I'll start with you.
A score out of what?
Maybe a score out of 10.
So a very positively biased 11. Well, first of all, great pleasure to be sitting with you all on a nice and sunny Davos day. So it's been just over 30 days since COP28. And in case you're wondering, yes, we are all still suffering withdrawal symptoms, waking up in the middle of the night, sweating about loss and damage fund and decarbonization accelerators. But COP28, for me, was really a moment where the world came together to agree on and to deliver on the UAE consensus as a response to the first ever global stocktake. There were a number of, I think, unprecedented outcomes, including the fact that 198 or so countries came together to agree, as you mentioned, on the transition away from fossil fuels in an orderly, just and equitable manner towards net zero. Also agreed to triple renewables, double energy efficiency, to double adaptation, managed to bring together $85 billion in new commitments really across the spectrum of climate and nature action agenda, operationalized the loss and damage fund, delivered on many outcomes, including health and education. And this was all before breakfast. But look, for me, what really the COP represents, and to go to your question, was the inclusivity aspect that really Dr. Sultan Al-Jaber, as president of COP28, identified and outlined at the get-go, realizing that we will only really make significant and authentic headway on big issues, big existential issues like climate change and nature degradation, if we can come together across sectors, across geographies, across communities of the world. And that's what COP28 managed to achieve. We had about 90,000 people who attended, and yes, maybe that was a record in terms of numbers, but again, it's what that number represented. It was really across heads of state and ministers that you would expect at a COP meeting, but really an unprecedented engagement by business, by philanthropy, by civil society, by indigenous peoples, by youth, really coming together, building on their respective strengths, not canceling each other out, building on their respective strengths to deliver a much more ambitious climate and nature action agenda. And that's exactly what underpinned the inaugural COP28 Business and Philanthropy Climate Forum, which was the first ever engagement opportunity right up front, so alongside the Leaders Summit or the World Climate Action Summit, where we saw 1,300 or so CEOs, 40% of which were from the great nations across the global south, 40% women representation, and really spanning the whole spectrum of industry, from energy to finance, from space to fashion, and 400 heads of philanthropies, again from over 40 nations in the world, coming together to help to generate and create that multiplier effect on impact, bringing together government capital with business capital and philanthropic capital. And that forum itself alone helped to generate $7 billion in new private sector commitments towards the climate and nature action agenda. So again, it's the inclusivity dimension which I think really underpinned the success of COP28 and which I believe will be carried forward into COP29 and COP30 and really should underpin all the multilateral efforts that we are engaging in today to solve the world's greatest challenges.
I agree with your point. I think what's perhaps most interesting about COP28 was that we saw business being built in rather than bolted on, because throughout COPs of the past, business hasn't necessarily been central to the conversation, and the amount of climate financing commitments that we saw in COP28 really reflects the ongoing role of the private sector at future COPs now, I think.
Yeah, and if I might just add, and this is a personal reflection, that's perhaps why previous COPs haven't perhaps been as effective in action and implementation as they have been in announcements and pledges, is because the private sector wasn't properly integrated into the process. And this is where, if done properly, the private sector, I think, can act as a glue that helps to, or the connective tissue, if you will, that helps to bind one COP presidency to the other and deliver consistent action throughout the year, not just from one big summit to another big summit a year later. So this is precisely what we need to try and do, and we've been having many discussions with the United Nations, and more specifically the UNFCCC, to figure out how we can do that and institutionalize business, and more specifically business and philanthropy, in the COP process going forward.
We'll come back to that point. So Badr has given me an 11. Dan, over to you. What's your view when it comes to scoring COP28, and how credible is this call to transition away from fossil fuels?
So on scoring, I'm traditionally a hard grader. I would say if you were evaluating it compared to what they hoped would be achieved and what they hoped would come out of a negotiated agreement, it was close to 10. I'd say looking at it from what's needed to actually make the difference that the global stocktake raised, and which all the science day by day is showing us that we're still wildly off course. And as COPs go in terms of what its legacy will be, and if we use this inflection point in history, I'd say a 7. I think it was overarchingly positive. I think it's much like the Winston Churchill quote on democracy. It's flawed, but it's still better than anything else out there. There's lots of criticisms about COP. Why didn't we get an agreement like this 30 years ago? And it may well be years too late, but it's important that we did it now. I do think that what makes it most significant, and what we have to continue to really keep our eyes on, is the implementation and operationalization. That's what, we have to go from the rhetoric of the commitments to actually implementing it. And that's where I think the engagement of the private sector is so critical. This cannot be done without corporations really systemically institutionalizing it. And we're seeing that, and I think the broad engagement and inclusivity is very, very important for that to happen. But there has to continue to be real accountability, oversight, and a scrutiny to make sure that this is moving forward, or we won't come anywhere close to meeting mid-century net zero goals. I mean, as we've seen from the science, we're not there yet as we approach 2030 and those goals, let alone 2050. And so making sure that we keep everyone engaged in that way will be the key part. And I think the private sector has a remarkably important role in that.
The UAE being a systemically important producer of fossil fuels obviously got a lot of headlines in the lead up to COP28. There were some who said that oil and gas as an industry is genuinely part of the problem, so they should be part of the solution. There were others who said it's impossible for this industry to be involved in at all, and the UAE, because of its vested economic interests, could perhaps influence or tilt the conversation in favor of those fossil fuel producers. What's your view? Oil and gas being part of the conversation, net negative or net positive on the outcome? Would that have changed the 7 to a 10?
No, I come from a diplomatic background. I've been back and forth with this in the State Department for many years. And so I firmly believe that we have to have all key actors at the table. There is no solution to this without having oil and gas producers and the major states which produce that as part of this as part of this discussion. I think there has to be, again, real legitimacy. We have to really ensure that there's not the greenwashing that I think frequently comes with this, that actions are being measured and that there's repercussions if there's not actions. But I think that they have to, again, we don't get anywhere close to meeting net zero goals unless it's that the oil and gas industry as a whole is part of this conversation. So yes, we need to move much more rapidly to renewables. I think that in terms of what was laid out as a goal in the relative short term, the next 2-5 years. Of course, we're not going to see that over the next generation or two. We have to see it, and how quickly we do it, how we seize this opportunity of the energy transition, and again, how that's really institutionalized state by state, company by company, is really going to be where the difference is felt on, is 1.5 even remotely alive, and how quickly can we get there?
Absolutely fair point. Rachel, welcome into the conversation. It's great to have you here as well. So what's your view? What score do you give COP28 and this question of credibility regarding the transition away from fossil fuels?
Well, so I think in terms of, I liked your diplomatic framing. So in terms of what the UAE said it wanted to achieve, then it's a 10, because that first 72 hours was pledge after pledge after pledge on every possible matrix. And I think the presidency did a very good job to put food on the agenda, to put health on the agenda. We had cooling pledges and methane pledges and whatever. The problem is that from a multilateral standpoint, they're pledges, so it's a 5. That's not necessarily the presidency's fault. It's the intergovernmental community's inability to meet the science. And I think that COP28 was also very important because we kind of pulled the Band-Aid off. We do not have global unanimity on the urgency of the transition that is necessary, or the way in which that transition is going to play out. Within hours of the agreement, and I think it was an important agreement, and it's important diplomatic language, we had member states saying, well, actually, I'm not going to be bound by that. And so rather than sort of pretending like we don't have a disagreement, we have a number of countries who are oil and gas producers whose business model is that by the middle to the second half of this century, they'll still be in the fossil fuel production business, but they'll be the best at it, the cheapest at it, and that's fine if it meets the science. If it doesn't meet the science, then it's not fine. So I think COP28 sort of just laid it all out, right? Here we are, it's like a family meal, we don't all agree. And so there's lots of work to be done now. But I think that finance is the piece that always pulls the puzzle together. If there is trade, if there is a terms of trade that works for the world, if there is investment flowing into emerging markets and developing economies, if the cost of capital is reasonable, then everybody can come to perhaps a better or a more a larger agreement. And I think that what we also saw at COP28 is that without that financial deal on the table, it's very difficult, especially for emerging markets, developing economies, to come and sort of make all of the agreements that are necessary. But COP28 has to be the sort of last pledge COP, right? We've got to get from pledges to binding commitments. But I think, everybody was there. And it's an effective presidency that gets everybody there. Now we're all there. Now we've got to go beyond just pledging.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point, Rachel. And to that point, one of the major criticisms of COP is that what we see on the ground are promises made that don't eventually become promises kept. So to follow up on that, what would you say are the mechanisms that are needed to ensure that what is said at COP ends up becoming what is done?
So the UN, is traditionally the place where governments are held to account. And it's going to be very important now because we're going into a second generation of nationally determined contributions. They have to be total economy and all gases. So there's no sort of plausible deniability, well, we're just going to make this about renewable energy. Everything's in now, and countries will need a lot of help. And countries have to hold themselves to account. That's how the UN works. The charter begins with we the peoples, right? It's not the Secretary General's job or the UNFCCC's Secretariat's job. They make it all transparent, but we have to hold each other to account within the international system. What's a really struggle now, I think, but there's incredible work going on, is how to hold non-state actors in diplomatic language to account. How do you hold companies to account? How do you hold cities and regions and other actors to account? Now, of course, in an ideal world, governments would be regulating the Paris Agreement. We would have banking supervision everywhere. We would have financial regulations everywhere that sort of say, if you're going to promise to be net zero, then you better actually be net zero. We're not quite in that world yet. The EU is moving, Singapore's moving, the US is sort of moving, the UK is moving, others are moving. But that needs to be a global movement. So what we need to see over the next couple of years really is a move from voluntary into better supervised accountability for non-state actors when they promise, so that if the oil and gas industry stands up and says, okay, we're going to X out methane from gas operations by 2030, there's a consequence to them not doing so.
Sure, Dan, you go.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. I was just going to follow up on Rachel's point, because I think you've just perfectly outlined both the remarkable opportunities and also the real limits of structures like these, and why it can't just be the UNFCCC in isolation, but it has to be a much broader stakeholder initiative with corporations at the table. On the one hand, government regulatory action is incredibly important in all this, and you just referenced some of this. In our work advising companies, there's been this remarkable sea change from voluntary commitments to the regulatory framework. Everyone, for the last few years, has been focused on when is the SEC's final climate risk disclosure rule going to come out, and yet in the last 6 months, it's almost been superseded, because in the EU you have the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and the fact that many companies will have to start reporting on Scope 1, 2, and 3. In California, they've just passed 3 pieces of legislation, one of which came into effect on January 1st, and again affects greenwashing claims and what we do with offsets. There's other jurisdictions, and so companies are looking at this and saying, we can't afford to hold back. We need a global systemic approach, and so we have to start institutionalizing this much more quickly and much more comprehensively. And so that is really driving a change in corporations. And I think that will, that will continue to be augmented, because there's so much in the works, particularly coming out of the EU, but in a range of other jurisdictions. By the same token, you mentioned finance, which is absolutely right, and I can say from working in government, I mean, we all spent countless hours trying to think about how we maximize sovereign state contributions to some of these funds. And the fact is, even if we're giving several $1 billion, that's such a drop in the bucket of what's needed to fuel the energy transition. And by all kind of research and accounts, it's going to be $2, $3, $4 trillion a year that's needed in some of this, and that can't be done without corporate partners and unleashing the private sector to move forward in that way. And so I do think you'll continue to see this progression into the regulatory framework. It's quite important. There has to be accountability. It's why I think the stock take was so important. It's why COP in 2025, next year, is going to be particularly important with the new NDCs demanded, and why we have to keep measuring how close we are to 2030. we have to keep focused on what's being done. For us to get anywhere close to 2050 net zero goals means we really have to have half of that done by 2030. And if you're going to get anywhere close to half by 2030, you need regulatory impacts now. I mean, this is the critical year or two, and companies adapting all that. And that is happening episodically, but not comprehensively, and we're not nearly, obviously, on pace to do that.
Badr, can you speak to this as well, and in particular to this point of how do we ensure that promises made are promises kept when it comes to the conclusion of COPs like the one we saw in Dubai?
So in many ways, your line of questioning, but also the insights that you're getting really goes to the crux of both the challenge, but also the opportunity. If you're using suboptimal machinery to solve these challenges, you're going to get suboptimal outcomes. So the machinery itself has to be both representative, really, of the whole world, and also have teeth of sorts. So what does that look like for a process like COP? And this is precisely what COP28 and the presidency of COP28 was trying to do. It has the existing system that it needs to work with and work through, but is there an opportunity to, this word is perhaps overused, but disrupt or enhance that system to make sure that both of those things are in place? And again, this is not a one-off sort of conference. It's a year-long process, and it feeds into other presidencies. So it has to be, that continuity has to be there across. So taking the business and philanthropy dimension, what does institutionalization of business and philanthropy look like as part of a COP process? Of course, COP stands for the Conference of the Parties, hence a national approach. How does one expand that to the partners? How does one make sure that business and philanthropy and also subnational actors at the mayor's level are integrated into the process and not a sort of add-on, as you mentioned? I think that's doable. We will have some exciting announcements to make, including as soon as tomorrow, that really touches on this. And so I'm making this point, as I think you're hearing here, is we have to be careful that, yes, we need to keep pushing governments, yes, we need to push businesses and make sure businesses are held to account, but we also need to work on building a better system for system change. And I don't think enough of that, quite frankly, has been done. I'm not a COP veteran, as many are, but looking back over the last close to 30 years of experience, the system itself hasn't changed anywhere near as much as the opportunity and the challenge has. So that's something we need to make sure we carry into COP29 and indeed COP30. Just want to make one point, if I may, because philanthropy was mentioned, and I do think that philanthropy plays quite a special role. It's often seen as a relatively small player, and in some parts of the world even regarded with a high degree of suspicion. The reality is philanthropic capital is dispersed in the trillions of dollars a year. What we can measure today is only about $1 trillion, but it's likely closer to $2 trillion or even more. And to put that in perspective, using a climate analogy, at the $1 trillion mark, that's more than 10 times the total amount of climate finance provided by developed countries to developing countries last year. So it's not insignificant, but the most exciting aspect is its quality. The fact that it can be, when deployed in the right ways, more flexible, more risk tolerant, and more equitable in deployment, and can therefore help to create and generate that multiplier effect to take us from the billions that we have to the trillions that we need. And that's something that I think, again, institutionalizing it, yes, we can call it private sector and private capital, but I do think we also need to call out the unique attributes of these different pools of capital to make sure that when they do come together, they do create that multiplier effect.
I don't want to front run your announcement, but I think you've just given me a scoop. Are you saying that COP is getting a name change?
Not a name change per se, but it's a supplementary process to make sure that we are including the partners on an ongoing basis, on an institutionalized basis. So it will be a game changer.
I don't want to rain on the parade because I think it's really important what business and philanthropy did at COP28. But this is an intergovernmental process. In a year when more people are going to go to the polls than has ever happened in human history before, it is about people holding their governments to account for acting on something that they all agreed to in 2015. And that's really important because some governments are really uncomfortable with anybody other than the government saying what's going to happen, right? They're very happy to have civil society and philanthropy and everything, fine. But when it comes to agreeing, it's my negotiator, it's my elected official, it's my minister, it's my civil servant. And so I think that while we're building these partnerships and while we're delivering, if climate is everything, everything is climate, everybody's working on climate, we do have to strengthen. And this is a challenge for the United Nations beyond just climate. It's our entire sort of international community. But at the end of the day, the people who sign the agreements, the people who stand there and are to be held account, are people who, for most countries in the world, are elected, for some not, and they are government representatives. And that's the weakest link at the moment.
Yeah. So the way we talked about it as shorthand in government was that there was COP and there's Greater Metropolitan COP. So COP is exactly the negotiation, how we're getting there, what's being, and that, again, has moved, but more incrementally. It's the Greater Metropolitan COP that has seen this kind of sea change.
Yeah.
And even from Glasgow 2 years ago, which had 30,000 to this with 90,000. And so making sure that that delta is being used in an effective manner, in a credible manner, and it's not just rhetoric and the potential for greenwashing, and how to engage them in the right way, takes its own, enormous amount of energy and coordination. And they're both related in terms of what the ultimate impact and efficiency of the process is, but they are still distinct processes.
And I just make a point, there's no suggestion, and it would be a major issue if this was seen as shifting responsibility per se. But I think there is broad acceptance that it has to be an all of the above approach if we're going to get there. And again, not just with climate and nature. I mean, we were having some discussions earlier today. The UAE is hosting the WTO meetings next month. And I wasn't exactly aware as to how, again, mechanisms for engagement in the private sector, apparently they don't exist. So you're having big discussions about global trade and business is not sitting at the table in an institutionalized way or in a formalized way. So again, I do think there is something to be said about re-looking at these structures and making sure that representative groups are represented. People who, and so many stakeholders are not just being acted upon, but are being acted with or in partnership with. It makes a huge difference, I think, to the outcomes. And we have a case in point with a very recent example in COP28. The energy in the room, when you had business sitting together with philanthropy, with policymakers, was incredible. And we need to capture that and scale it rapidly because, as has been, I think, and again, widely accepted, we're running out of time.
Just speaking of being in the room, Dan, I wanted to ask you about something that will obviously be very close to your heart. In the lead up to COP, in all of the meetings that took place in advance, Secretary Kerry was there in the UAE on the ground, standing next to Dr. Sultan, standing next to world leaders, making sure that the US had a really significant presence. He has decided to step away from that role. Look, it might be a stretch to ask, but do you have any inside track on what his thinking is, as we come into another really critical COP in Azerbaijan, what that's going to mean for the US's role and presence in this conversation?
I certainly don't have any news to break on what Secretary Kerry will be doing next, and I know he's thinking through that. But his goal is to have as much impact on this set of issues as possible. And he's obviously had remarkable impact in the US. I can't think of somebody else that could have elevated this issue in the same way with his degree of credibility on the core climate issues, with his contacts on the global stage, and working so closely with Dr. Sultan and many other colleagues around the world, and with a direct line to the president, and really showing that this set of issues was empowered and elevated. And we worked from day one to make sure that the US was reasserting leadership, from entering Paris Agreement on day one to the internationally determined contribution that we put forward within the first 100 days, and then obviously financing it through the IRA and the ability to actually try to move forward. That's all so important. There's also so much more to be done. And I think we worked as well to make sure that there's a lot of very legitimate questions on what happens with America come this November, and if there were to be a second Trump term, what that would look like. And we, I hope, have done enough to future-proof this as best as possible. That was certainly what we told all of our partners around the world as of day one. And I think through things like the IRA, to have the economic genie out of the bottle, the private sector is now engaged in this way. And as we're seeing in the energy transition in the US, I think the IRA has this is the Investment Reduction Act, the greatest climate investment in history, I think, of any country. But it's disproportionately impacting and benefiting many red states who are seeing the benefits. And so I think as people see this as an opportunity and an economic opportunity to make sure that we are part of this new global trend, hopefully it means that we can't take too many steps backward because we don't have the time. This has to be a moment when we're accelerating.
Just to talk politics for a second, there's a non-negligible risk that President Trump will come back. He just came out of the Iowa caucuses with a big win. What do you think that would mean for US climate outcomes?
Well, again, I'm hoping that much of what we've laid the groundwork for will continue to exist in some ways. I think once there's a constituency that supports it in the US and globally, and we see that it's broad, it's in the US national security interest to be more energy independent, it's in our economic interest, it provides, as Secretary Kerry has talked frequently about, the greatest economic opportunity since the Industrial Revolution in terms of this movement towards renewable energy and the jobs it provides and a whole range of other things. But there will be there will undoubtedly be some rollbacks if there's a Trump administration again. And I think as we saw in the first Trump administration, we have to make sure that every component piece of this is empowered. And so in the way that corporations took the lead, state and local entities took the lead during the Trump years, I think all those other component stakeholders will have to be re-empowered to continue to move this forward and make sure we don't lose this incredibly valuable time at this moment.
All right, absolutely fascinating. We only have about 10 minutes left, and there's a few more questions I wanted to get through on some specific issues, so let's roll through them now. And Rachel, I wanted to ask you about the specifics on the carbon market and carbon pricing here, because at COP, we saw the IMF Managing Director, Kristalina Georgieva, teaming up with Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala and Ursula von der Leyen to really make the claim and put a stake in the ground for carbon pricing and putting a price on this and developing a transparent and effective carbon market. Out of COP28, though, we didn't necessarily see significant progress there. I'm wondering why, first of all, and why is it important to put mechanisms like this in place?
So if we don't put a price on the pollution that is causing the problem, we're sort of fighting with one hand, if not two hands, behind our backs. And carbon pricing was a political imperative in the G7 and the G20 going into Paris. We have very specific language about the role that carbon markets can play and the direction of all financial flows in the Paris Agreement. And then it suddenly sort of became a technical issue. It's politically difficult. Oh, no, we can't talk about carbon taxes. We can't do carbon fees, whatever. And we've, really that lack of intergovernmental agreement and the lack of speed with which, technically it's Article 6 that refers to carbon markets. The lack of progress there is really hampering things. So companies have got to move through a transition. Companies have got to get to net zero. They're going to need to invest in the technologies and the processes that get them there quickly. They're going to need to be able to access the carbon markets to do that. In the absence of government taking action, then they're wanting to use voluntary carbon markets. Countries are desperate for investment, especially in their adaptation and their resilience. And they desperately would like to have high integrity carbon markets working for them. High integrity because we're way beyond the ability to just sort of, keep on polluting and then just offset. Everybody's got to be on a trajectory down, countries and companies. And then we have to do the math around how that works. So, one of the reasons why I don't think it was an 11 is that the presidency had to kick Article 6 negotiations to Baku. Not good. And so we see a lot of what I would call sort of unregulated Article 6.2 activity, countries offering to buy offsets from other countries, lack of transparency, no rules around that, no agreed frameworks, which simply feeds into two things. One, a fear, especially by young people, that we're just kicking the can down the road when we don't have time, and this manufactured fear on the far right or the right in populist movements in across the world that that to get to net zero is somehow going to put a boot on the neck of the small person, right? And so voluntary carbon markets are small. They could get much bigger. They are desperately needed. There's a demand from the corporates and there's a demand from countries, but people need to have confidence that the rules are there. So now, at COP28, we all stood up. We said, there's rules now for companies as a code of practice that we've put out into the market, which companies are starting to use. There are principles for those who are issuing credits through ICVCM, our sister organization, and now we've got to start using it. And so 2024, despite the fact that governments kicked the negotiations down the road for a year, is a year where we have to put proof into the concept. And it's important we do it. It's important we do it quickly, especially when we've got some difficult elections in November.
Badr, this would be just another burden on business, though, wouldn't it?
Well, it's not about burden. I mean, one of the challenges, and really this needs to happen very fast, and it hasn't happened yet, is standardization. Otherwise, everybody's playing to different rule books, and it's chaos, and that needs to happen. And I think business, when rules are clear and they are standardized, business, I mean, for the most part, know what they need to follow. And then they can be held accountable and will be, if they're public companies, held accountable by their shareholders for either following those rules or not. So that's critical, and that's something that absolutely has to be pursued. Keeping in mind, again, the COP28 presidency isn't just about the few weeks that happened in Dubai. So there's a lot of work that will be done. In fact, one of the key reasons why Dr. Sultan Al-Jaber himself isn't at Davos is because he's sitting there figuring exactly this aspect out. And yes, I rated it an 11, but the reality is we've got to take that 11 to 1,000,000, right? And how do we do that? It's exactly what you said, is making sure that we, you know, as the saying goes, vision without implementation is hallucination. So what does that implementation look like across every single of one of those action item agendas? There will be a lot that can be done in 11 months, and there'll be a lot of coordination required between 28, 29, and 30 and beyond to make sure we have consistent delivery and not a case of 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And that really goes to the question you asked about the politics. Look, I'm a simple businessman, so I wouldn't dare comment on the infinitely complex permutations and combinations of political outcomes. But what I will say, just looking at, you know, and observing recent history, this is part of the problem. You have many governments who come in new and decide as one of their first acts to sort of tear up the policy books and throw them out. And predominantly, I should also add, in Europe and in the US. And that's a killer to a process like COP, which is why to have that continuity and that consistency in delivery, this is where the so-called non-state actors need to come in to make sure that we can deliver and continue on the action agenda, whichever way the political winds are blowing in capitals across the world.
I would just say, I think far from being a burden on companies, again, this is a moment that's all hands on deck. I think you need to try absolutely everything. First of all, obviously companies have to do as much as they can to cut their emissions and decarbonize. But there's going to be some component that they're not going to be able to do without something like offsets. And so for them to do that, they want to make sure that that's done in a credible and legitimate manner and can be trusted. And so the more, you know, kind of consistency there is in that, the more legitimacy, the better it is for companies and the more that we actually get achieved. But this is a time that we have to be thinking about everything. That's why I think the IRA is so important. It's why carbon border adjustment mechanisms are so important. It's why the regulatory piece is important. And it's why on renewables, you've got to have everything at the table. It's not just solar and wind, but also hydro and nuclear. And even with all that, we are probably not going to come close enough to 1.5, but we have to keep that alive as the North Star and keep striving, because truly every 1/10 of a degree you get higher than that, we're in just kind of existential crisis.
And if I may just add to that, so again, in many ways this brings together a lot of what we've been talking about, but a key aspect in terms of making sure that we can move into implementation is making sure that the climate agenda and the human development agenda and the nature agenda are no longer seen as mutually exclusive. Those need to come together, and that's the only way we're going to be building trust in the system and ultimately for the stakeholders that are impacted by this, including, if you take the continent of Africa, the 600 million people in the world who are still to be afforded accessible and affordable energy, who still don't even have electricity. So those agendas need to come together. The nature piece is incredibly important. My wife wouldn't forgive me if I didn't mention that. But as we know, it can take us at least 1/3 of the way towards a 1.5-degree pathway. So we need to, again, find ways to build the nature component into the climate agenda as an additive process and not just seeing it as a zero-sum game or some sort of trade-off between climate, nature, and human development.
Absolutely fascinating. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed the conversation so far. I have one more question for you all, and it's a rapid-fire question as we close out our session here in Davos, Switzerland. The question is, as we come into COP29 in Azerbaijan, what needs to be on the agenda and what can realistically be achieved? Rachel, I'd like to start with you.
Well, what I heard was that carbon funds domiciled in the UAE, as an example, are going to be transparent and adhere to the highest standards of integrity when they do bilateral deals with Liberia and Zambia, which I think is really good because we need to be able to manage our net zero contributions in partnership, right? So I think that's great. I think that the Azerbaijanis have got a very difficult task because we do need to have government agreement and we've got to keep up the path. And I think that they're probably going to need a few more women advising them on how to do it. I think it's frankly outrageous, and I mean, it's not a diplomatic mistake, it's outrageous to form an advisory committee for a COP and not have diversity in that. So there you go, Azerbaijan, get your women on your advisory group.
I like it. I like it. Dan, your thoughts?
It will be a challenging COP, I think, for both process reasons and the ability of a country like Azerbaijan to exercise the muscle, show the leadership, and be credible about what they're putting on the table. In terms of the agenda for the COP, I think following up, there's a lot that needs to be done on loss and damage. I think we saw some really good progress on something like the Global Methane Pledge, which will have impact. I would say keep it focused on impact. We have to focus on the implementation. And to that point, it's the actual prep for next year with the 2025 and the new NDCs that's going to be quite important in terms of, again, making sure that we can try to keep 1.5 alive.
Badr.
So it's the elephant in the room, Scope 3 emissions, really. I mean, we've skirted around it for a while, and I think we need to make sure, and this is, again, I believe something that the COP28 presidency itself is going to be really focusing on in the coming months, but it is something that we need to tackle once and for all at a COP. And so I do think that's something that Azerbaijan can sink its teeth into effectively, we hope.
Okay, well, let's hope we get some positive outcomes. We are out of time, so we'll leave it there.